Hey guys, tonight we step into a quieter kind of story, one with no heroes, no grand victories and no tidy ending. It's 1933, and the country has slipped beneath the weight of something heavy and slow. Factories are closed. Bread is not just scarce, but sacred. Whole towns whisper instead of shout now, and hunger has become the quiet neighbour everyone knows by name. This is the memory of a boy. Not a famous boy, not a leader or a soldier, but a child whose ribs poked through his shirt and whose days were made of walking, hoping and learning how to be invisible when the world had no kindness left to give. Before we really begin, take a breath. Let the noise of the day settle down like dust on an empty road. If this kind of storytelling helps you unwind or brings you comfort, maybe tap the like button or subscribe if you'd like to come back again. Only if it feels right, of course. And if you're listening from somewhere far or late in the night, I'd love to know where you are and what time it is there. It's strangely comforting, knowing this little story is travelling softly through time zones and bedrooms. Now dim the lights, let the hum of a fan or the creak of your own quiet space hold you still, and let's gently step into another world. The story won't rush. It's here to walk with you. The boy didn't wake to an alarm clock. He woke because hunger tapped him on the inside and wouldn't stop. It had been days since anything truly warm touched his belly. His body had learned to accept the emptiness like a second skin. His name, for our purposes, doesn't really matter. He might as well be called Hollow, or Hope, or maybe both. He was 10, but sometimes he felt 1,000. His skin was stretched over bones like paper, his eyes too serious for that small face. And he moved like someone who had learned early that asking for things made people frown. He slept in a corner of what had once been a tool shed, though no one had tools anymore. The walls were patched with flattened flour sacks and bits of rusted tin roofing. On cold nights, wind slid through the cracks without apology. The floor was hard dirt, pressed flat by sleep and years. A wool blanket, stiff from rain and too many nights of dust, was all he had. He shared the space with his mother, who said little anymore. Her words had become careful things doled out only when needed. She had once told stories. Now she mostly stared at the same spot on the wall, where a water stain had formed a shape she said looked like a bird, or he couldn't see it, but he nodded anyway. When he stepped out that morning, the cold hit his skin like it had been waiting. His coat was a handed-down thing, with one sleeve longer than the other. The buttons had vanished long ago. He tied it closed with a bit of twine. His boots weren't really boots anymore. They had belonged to someone else, maybe even 2 or 3 someones before him. The leather had split and peeled away like a snake shedding skin. He lined them with newspaper if he could find any, and when it rained, his toes got wet anyway. He had stopped minding. Wet was better than frostbite. Outside, the road was quiet. The frost still clung to the fence posts, and the grass hadn't yet given up its brittle silence. Chimneys no longer smoked. People had stopped burning coal and wood when the coal man stopped coming, and the woodpile turned to splinters. The air was sharp and dry, with the strange smell of rust and earth, as if the land itself had run out of ideas. He walked with no particular destination, which was how most days went. The church kitchen might be open if the pastor had something to boil. Sometimes there was soup, thin enough to see the bottom of the pot, but warm, and that was something. The boy had learned not to arrive too early. The early crowd fought harder. The desperate ones. Better to wait, and hope the back end of the line still held something. Or maybe the grocer's wife had tossed out soft apples again. She didn't like doing it, but she didn't like keeping them either. Rot brought flies, and no one wanted more flies. His feet carried him past shuttered storefronts and windows thick with dust. Signs still hung on the doors, though the shops had closed months ago. Back soon, written in faded paint. They weren't coming back. He stopped for a moment to look at a cracked mirror leaning against a pile of trash. His reflection looked like someone else, pale, thin, cheeks hollow. His hair stuck out in wild directions. His shirt collar had been mended so many times the fabric resembled lace. At the corner near the tracks, he crouched down beside a stack of wooden crates. Sometimes, if he was lucky, a boxcar would pass by and someone might toss something off. a piece of stale bread, a tin can half full. Once he caught an orange. It had been slightly bruised, but perfect to him. He'd stared at it for nearly an hour before eating it slowly, one segment at a time, as if dragging out joy could make it last longer. But there was nothing today. No trains, just the soft groan of wind along the rail lines. He stood again and kept moving. Every few steps he checked the alleys. Some cats moved like shadows between trash cans, but even they had grown thinner. Hunger was the one thing they all shared now. Man, beast, child. It didn't discriminate. It simply waited and watched. He passed a man sitting on the curb with a harmonica. The tune he played was broken and slow. The man didn't look up. His hat sat upside down in front of him, but there were no coins inside, just a few buttons and a folded scrap of paper. The boy lingered for a moment, not for the music, but for the warmth of another person being still. Then he moved on. By midday, the wind had picked up. His coat flapped behind him. He found a broken bench and sat for a while, rubbing his hands together. His fingers had cracked again. The skin split easily in the cold. He tucked them under his arms. An older woman shuffled by and looked at him for a long second. Her eyes said she understood, but her hands were empty too. She kept walking. The boy knew better than to expect kindness, not because people were cruel, but because they were tired. Kindness took energy. Energy took food. Everyone was trying to hold on to whatever they had left. Even the light in the sky looked hungry. Still, he sat a moment longer, watching the world pass like a dream he didn't belong to. Then, as he always did, he stood up, pulled his coat tighter around him, and walked on. And that's where we leave him tonight. A child, thin and tired, moving through a world that forgot what full felt like. No bread in his hands, no boots worth the name, just motion. Just another day. He didn't always know where his legs were taking him, but that morning they wandered down past the old train yard and across the field behind the market that's still open twice a week when weather allowed. It wasn't a real market anymore, not like the stories his mother used to tell from when she was a girl, and the stalls were fat with oranges and bread loaves that steamed in the morning air. Now it was more like a whisper of a market. A few crates dragged out onto the gravel, some men standing with eyes sunk deep into their faces, trying to trade buttons or bits of wire for turnips too soft to cook. The boy never had anything to trade. What could he offer? His coat had already been patched with more hope than fabric, and his shoes had less soul than story. But sometimes, just sometimes, the shopkeepers took pity on him. Or maybe they just didn't want him standing there, staring with that hollow gaze that reminded them of their own children. A week ago, he'd gotten a potato with eyes already sprouting green. He had eaten around the bitter spots and saved the peel to boil again with a bit of onion skin. That had been one of the better days. Today the market had only 3 stalls open, and none of the men behind them looked like they had room for mercy. One glanced up, then looked away just as quickly. Another coughed into a cloth and tightened the rope on his barrel of apples that looked more bruised than fruit. The boy walked slowly, not begging, not speaking, just moving quietly past each table in a rhythm he knew well, a dance of silence and lowered eyes. He paused at the last table where an old woman with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders was selling half-rotten cabbage heads. They looked like they'd been picked too late, their leaves curling inward like they were ashamed of how far they'd fallen. He didn't speak, but she noticed him anyway. She always did. Miss Franny, they called her, though no one remembered if she'd ever been married, or had any family. She ran the old boarding house near the school, though there hadn't been boarders in months. Still, she stood there with her jars of pickled beets and her wrinkled green cabbage, and she watched people like she was, collecting their movements for a story no one had asked her to tell. She gave him a little nod, the kind that meant nothing but also everything. Then she turned away, fiddled with something beneath her table, and when she turned back, she set down a cracked enamel bowl with a few scraps of cabbage trimmings inside, the kind of pieces most people would throw to pigs, if they had pigs anymore. She didn't look at him, didn't say a word. She just wiped her hands on her apron and began retying her scarf as if he wasn't even there. The boy stepped forward slowly, hands trembling a little in the wind. He picked up the bowl, nodded once in return and backed away. Didn't say thank you, not because he wasn't grateful, but because words felt too large for something so delicate. If he had spoken, it might have broken whatever quiet agreement had just passed between them. He held the bowl close, feeling the cold of the metal against his palms, and started walking again, retracing his steps toward the alley behind the baker's place. That alley had become something of a ritual for him. The baker was a wiry man with a limp and a bad temper, but his assistant was softer. A girl named Ella who always had flour on her cheek and shoes that looked too big. She was maybe 15, maybe 16, and her smile came slow, like it was being borrowed. Sometimes when the baker wasn't looking, she'd leave bits of crust out back for the stray dogs. And once or twice, for him, today the alley smelled like yeast and ash, the kind of smell that makes your stomach ache harder, because it promises more than it can give. He crept in, quiet as he could, and waited by the crate they used to dump old papers and bent baking pans. A few pigeons fluttered off when they heard him, and he stood still until the alley settled again. Then he crouched beside the crate and opened his cabbage bowl. The leaves were wilted and yellowing, but they were something. He picked at them slowly, chewing each bite like it was important, letting the taste stay on his tongue longer than necessary. There was a bitter edge to them, but also a sweetness underneath. The kind of sweetness that comes from something that has almost gone bad, but hasn't given up yet. As he finished the last piece, he heard the back door creak. He froze, but it was just Ella. She stepped out, holding a tin in one hand, and looked around like she wasn't sure what she was hoping to see. When her eyes landed on him, she didn't smile, not exactly, but something in her face softened. She walked toward him and crouched down beside the crate, setting the tin on the ground between them. "There's nothing fresh today," she said, almost too softly. "But I burnt a tray of rolls, and you didn't want them." She nudged the tin toward him. Inside were 3 misshapen rolls, their tops a little black, their edges hard as wood. He looked at her for a long moment, then back at the rolls. He didn't reach for them. Right away. Instead, he said, "Thank you," the words dry in his throat. She didn't reply. She just stood and dusted off her apron, then disappeared back inside. He stayed there in the alley, tucked between the bakery wall and the crate, and bit into the first roll. It tasted like smoke and flour and salvation. The outside was hard, but the centre still had warmth. He closed his eyes as he chewed, slowly, carefully, and let the heaviness in his chest loosen for a moment. When he had finished all 3, he leaned back against the wall and let the cold press against his ribs. He didn't move for a long time, not because he was comfortable, but because he didn't want the moment to end. It was rare to feel full, even for a little while. That kind of feeling deserved stillness. Eventually he stood. His legs felt steadier. He tucked the empty tin behind the crate, not wanting to take it, not wanting to leave it dirty. Then he made his way out of the alley, past the broken fence and the laundry lines that hung with more holes than cloth. He didn't know where he was going next, maybe back to the shed, maybe to the railroad bridge where the men sometimes gathered in the evening to trade stories and cigarettes rolled from old newspaper. The sky had turned a muted silver, and the wind carried the kind of cold that bites harder the longer you ignore it. But for once his steps didn't drag. There was a weight in his belly, and with it, a kind of clarity. Maybe tomorrow would be harder again. Maybe there wouldn't be any cabbage scraps or burned rolls. But for now, he had eaten, and that, in this world, was something close to a miracle. As he walked along the edge of the field, his boots flapping softly against the dirt, a crow called overhead and flew low across the grass, its wings sharp and sure. The boy watched it for a moment, then pulled his coat tighter and kept walking quiet and slow, with nothing but the road ahead and the memory of warmth behind him. By the time the boy made it back toward the edge of town, the light had begun to fade in that slow, watery way it always did during winter. The sky softened to a pale grey that seemed to melt into the bare branches of the trees, and the air grew sharper, biting at the tips of his ears and the corners of his mouth. His stomach, though no longer aching, was beginning to empty again, the rolls long gone, and already swallowed by a body that had become too used to being hungry. But the warmth from the bakery still clung to him like a memory, and he let it carry him, step by step, across the uneven ground that led back toward the place he called home, though home was far too generous a word for what it was. The shack, if it could be called that, sat hunched beneath a stand of crooked trees on the edge of an abandoned orchard. No one tended the trees anymore. They grew wild now, branches gnarled and fruitless, shadows twisting across the snow-dusted grass like long fingers reaching for something that had already been taken. The shack had no door, just a bent curtain made from 2 stitched-together feed sacks that fluttered whenever the wind shifted. The roof sagged in the middle, and one corner had begun to peel upward where the nails had rusted away. Still it stood, and when you had nothing else, 4 half walls and a roof full of holes was better than sky alone. He ducked inside and paused to let his eyes adjust. The light in here was always dim, even during the day, and the corners carried the damp smell of wood rot and old wool. His mother sat in the far corner, hunched beneath a blanket that had once been navy blue, but had faded to a dusty grey over the years. Her hands were curled in her lap, fingers stiff from the cold, and her eyes were closed, though he could tell she wasn't sleeping. She rarely did. Sleep was a thing that used to come easy, back before the days were stitched together with worry and silence. She opened her eyes as he entered, and gave him a slow, almost invisible nod. That was their version of greeting now. They didn't waste words on things that didn't need them. He crossed the floor carefully, stepping over a loose board that always creaked, and sat beside her without saying anything. The blanket stretched enough to cover part of his legs, and he leaned into her side just enough to share some of her warmth. They sat like that for a while, listening to the wind scrape against the outside boards and the faint rustling of dry leaves trying to hold on. After a time she spoke, her voice low and quiet, almost like she was talking to herself. She asked if he had eaten, and he said yes. He didn't tell her about the alley, or the burnt rolls, or Miss Franny's cabbage trimmings. Just yes. That was all she needed. Her hand moved slowly to rest on his, and he felt the cold of her skin, the thinness of it. Her touch was light, but it held something else too, something heavier than either of them could say out loud. Night came quickly, the kind of night that didn't feel like a blanket but a curtain closing off everything with a thud. He lay back on the floor beside the stove, though the stove hadn't worked in weeks. They'd burned through everything that could be spared, and now the metal was just a shell, a reminder. Sometimes he dreamed of fire crackling in there, red and gold and wild, enough to make the whole shack glow. But dreams were tricky things. They left you colder when you woke. He pulled his coat over himself and tucked his hands beneath his arms. His mother had already turned in, curled beneath the blanket with her face turned toward the wall. She always faced the wall now. He didn't know why. Maybe it made her feel less seen. Maybe she just didn't want to look at what the world had become. That night, the wind howled. Not loud, but steady. Like it had somewhere to be and didn't care what it passed through. The shack groaned in its sleep, the boards creaking as they shifted, but it held. Rain began to fall at some point, soft and thin. More mist than storm. The drops tapped against the tin roof like fingers drumming on a table. He listened to them, counted them in his head, tried to imagine they were music. In the darkness, thoughts came. Not the good kind, the kind that curled up in your chest and made your bones feel hollow. He thought of the boy who used to live 2 shacks over, the one with the red scarf and the laugh that sounded like it belonged in a better world. He'd been sent away a month ago, his mother gone before that. No one knew where. People didn't leave notes anymore. They just vanished. Hunger had a way of erasing things. He thought of the man who used to come by selling soap from a cart, who always had a joke and a tin of peppermints in his coat. He hadn't come in weeks. Maybe his cart had broken down, or maybe he'd just run out of jokes. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, not because he was tired, but because the dark was easier with your eyes shut. The floor was cold and his shoulder ached where it pressed into the boards, but he didn't move. Moving took more than he had left that day. In the morning, the light came back, slow and pale. He sat up slowly, blinking against the dim. His mother was still asleep or pretending to be. He didn't disturb her. Instead, he slipped out through the curtain and into the crisp morning air. The rain had left behind a thin sheen of frost, and the grass crackled beneath his boots as he walked. He didn't know where he was going yet, but he had to go. That was how the days worked. You kept going even when there was nowhere left to go. He walked past the orchard, past the rusted-out tractor that hadn't moved in a year, and past the skeleton of the schoolhouse, its windows boarded and its bell long since stolen. He stopped at the fence line that used to mark the edge of Mr. Langley's farm. The fence was falling apart now, half buried in weeds. The barn had collapsed in on itself and the fields had gone to seed. But he stood there anyway, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the rows where corn used to grow so tall you could disappear inside them. He remembered running through those fields once. It had been summer. He'd been barefoot, chasing a dog with one floppy ear. There had been laughter, real and round, and the sun had been a golden weight on his shoulders. It felt like a memory from someone else's life. He crouched down and touched the soil. It was dry, flaky, lifeless. The earth had stopped singing here. He rubbed the dirt between his fingers and let it fall away. He stayed there until the wind picked up again, urging him forward. He stood, brushed off his hands, and turned back towards town. Toward Miss Franny's stall and the alley near the bakery. Toward maybe there would be something today. A crust, a bruise, a nod. Maybe that was enough. And so he walked. The wind that pushed him back toward town wasn't cruel exactly, but it had an indifference to it, like a stranger brushing past without apology. It whistled through the brittle grass and stirred the fallen branches along the edge of the road, sending them clattering like loose bones. The boy tucked his hands into his coat and walked with his head low, shoulders hunched not from cold alone, but from habit. Walking had become his language. He walked when he needed food, walked when there was nothing left to try, walked to stay warm, walked to forget how still everything had become. He didn't go to Miss Franny's right away. It was still too early, and she didn't like being stared at while setting up her wares. Instead, he headed toward the old freight tracks, where the rail cars sometimes slowed just enough to toss things off. The rumour was that a few of the men up north who still had jobs in the coal yards would hide things in the cars and throw them clear once they reached the outskirts of town. Mostly it was a myth, or a kind of wish people passed around to make the waiting easier. But sometimes the boy found something. Once, it had been a tin of peaches, still sealed, dented at the side but not broken. He had opened it with a nail and a rock and eaten it with both hands, sweet syrup dripping down his wrists like melted gold. Another time it had been a pair of socks, too big but clean. He'd worn them for 3 weeks straight. This morning the tracks were empty, but he didn't mind. He liked the quiet here, the way the trees leaned close to listen, and the sound of the rails ticking and creaking as they cooled in the early light. He climbed onto the loading dock behind the abandoned grain depot and sat on a pile of old seed sacks, most of them frayed to threads. From here he could see the road winding out of town, the broken picket fences, the chimneys without smoke, the backs of houses where laundry used to flap like flags. Now the lines hung bare, or worse, sagged, with the same tired shirts and dresses that hadn't seen soap in weeks. He sat there until the air began to warm, just enough to draw a little steam from the soil, and then he heard footsteps behind him, not heavy, but close. He turned and saw a boy a little older than him, maybe 12 or 13, with a mop of dark hair and a jacket that looked like it used to belong to someone much bigger. The sleeves were rolled up and frayed at the cuffs, and he wore one glove and one mitten, both full of holes. The boy didn't speak at first. He just nodded and sat down beside him without asking. They watched the tracks together in silence for a while. Then the older boy spoke, his voice gravelly like he'd swallowed too much dust. "I'm Lou," he said, not looking over. The younger boy glanced at him, then nodded once. "I'm just me," he said. Lou gave a half smile, not the kind that meant happiness, but the kind that meant he understood. They didn't need many words. In times like this, names didn't matter. as much as silence shared with, someone who knew how to carry it. Lou pulled something from his coat pocket. It was a crust of bread, rough and hard, wrapped in wax paper that had already been used more than once. He broke it in half and handed one piece over without ceremony. The younger boy took it, his fingers brushing Lou's briefly. It was cold, dense, with a faint smell of smoke and yeast. He chewed slowly, careful not to finish too quickly. "Where you from?" Lou asked after a while. The boy shrugged. "Here now." Lou nodded again. That was enough. They stayed like that until the sun climbed higher, until the shadows shifted and the wind changed direction. Then Lou stood up, dusted his hands on his pants, and looked down the tracks. "Coal train's coming today," he said. "You hear?" The younger boy hadn't. He rarely heard much, but he didn't question it. Lou motioned for him to follow, and they walked down along the rails together, their footsteps light and measured, weaving around gravel and weeds. Lou had a kind of quiet confidence, the way someone walks who has already been alone too long and decided it's better to pretend you're not. He talked a little, mostly about small things, like how the freight trains always slowed before the bend, how you could sometimes smell what was inside if the wind was right. He said he had once smelled chocolate, though the car turned out to be full of burlap sacks and broken glass. Still, it had smelled like chocolate. They waited near the bend just past a stand of sycamores that had dropped all their leaves early that year. The ground was soft with moss and old straw, and they crouched in the shade with their eyes fixed on the horizon. The younger boy listened to the rhythm of Lou's breathing, steady and slow, and felt a strange comfort in it, like music played by someone who didn't know you were listening. The train came later than expected. They heard it before they saw it, the low moan of steel wheels and the faint rattling of distant cargo. When it appeared, a long dark snake winding its way between hills, Lou stood and took a step closer to the edge. The boy followed, heart beating a little faster. The cars clanked and hissed as they passed, each one marked with faded paint and rust. Most were closed tight, but near the back was an open car half full of coal. Lou took 2 steps forward and scanned the shadows inside. Then he pointed. There, near the edge, was a burlap-seamed sack, loosely tied. Lou's eyes lit up with the kind of sharpness that only comes from having gone too long without luck. He grabbed a stick and held it out. "If it's bread, I'll scream," he said with a grin. He reached with the stick and hooked the sack. Took a few tries, but finally he caught it just enough to pull it free. It dropped to the gravel with a thud, and they both ran toward it as the train rumbled past. Deafening for a moment. A wall of motion and metal. They waited until it passed, then crouched over the sack. Lou untied it carefully, fingers shaking, and peeled it open. It wasn't bread, it wasn't food at all, just rags. Greasy, torn rags, maybe used for oil or machines. Lou let out a sound that might have been a laugh, or maybe just breath escaping all at once. The younger boy looked at the pile and reached in. Beneath the rags was a strip of thick canvas, maybe part of a coat. He pulled it out. It was stiff and smelled of metal, but it was warm, and it could cover shoulders. Lou shook his head and sat down beside the sack. "Still better than nothing," he said. And the boy nodded, holding the canvas close, the edge already warming from his touch. They sat there a while longer, neither talking, both looking at the spot where the train had disappeared. Then Lou stood and stretched. "I head south tomorrow," he said. "Said there's work down there. Shoveling or something? Doesn't matter." The boy didn't ask how far south. He just looked at him for a long time and nodded once. Lou reached into his pocket again and pulled out another small crust, wrapped in the same piece of wax paper. He handed it over without a word, then turned and walked off along the tracks, his step steady, his figure growing smaller until he was just another part of the quiet landscape. The boy stayed behind. He held the crust in one hand, the strip of canvas in the other, and sat back down on the old seed sacks. The wind returned, softer now, and in the distance the trees whispered things no one had the strength to repeat. The sky turned white the next morning, not with the chilled light, but with the kind of low, heavy cloud that makes even sound feel muffled. Snow hadn't started falling yet, but it would. The boy could feel it in the way the air clung to his skin and in the stiffness of the ground beneath his feet as he walked past the broken fences near the south side of town. The strip of canvas from the coal train was draped around his shoulders like a second coat, stiff and stained, but heavy enough to block the wind from his back. It still smelled faintly of smoke and something chemical, but warmth had become more important than scent, more important than anything really. When your bones ache just from breathing, you learn to wrap yourself in whatever the world was willing to shed. He had woken early, long before the light had filled the cracks of the shack. His mother had stirred once, shifting beneath the blanket, but she didn't speak, and he didn't stay long enough to see if her eyes opened. There was nothing to say anyway. Hunger spoke for both of them now. It had become their shared language, a silent tongue made of looks and footsteps, and the way her hand shook when she tried to sew a patch onto his coat with thread that snapped after 2 inches. He walked until the town grew thinner around him, until the houses gave way to fields and rusted-out machinery that stood like skeletons sunk halfway into the frozen dirt. Here the road turned from gravel to mud, frozen hard in places where the ruts held old water, and he stepped carefully along the edges, boots slapping lightly with every step. He wasn't sure why he was walking this way. There was no food here, no warmth or shelter, or even the small kindnesses of Miss Franny's stall or Ella's flour-dusted hands. But something tugged him forward, maybe memory, or maybe just the need to see something different from the same tired alleys and closed-up stores. He came upon the riverbank by accident, the slow bend of the creek that had once been a playground in warmer times. Children used to wade in it, catching frogs and throwing pebbles, back before shoes became optional and fun became a luxury. The water now moved in slow curls, ice forming along the edges, the current soft like breath under a blanket. He crouched at the edge and dipped his fingers in, then pulled them back quickly. It was colder than he expected, the kind of cold that lingered in your knuckles and climbed slowly up your wrist. He rubbed his hands together, then tucked them back beneath the canvas strip and sat for a while on a flat rock near the bank. From here he could see across to the far side of the river, where a single plume of smoke was rising behind a thicket of scrub trees. It was thin, barely there, more like a sigh than a fire, but in this world even the faintest curl of smoke meant something. Someone was burning something, and that meant warmth, and warmth meant life. He hesitated. He wasn't one to approach strangers. Strangers didn't always mean safety. But the cold bit deeper than usual this morning, and the weight in his belly told him that today might not be as kind as yesterday. He stood and began following the river upstream, keeping the smoke in view, though it twisted and shifted with every gust of wind. The path was uneven, and he slipped once, landing hard on his knee. But he didn't cry out. Pain had become another part of the routine, just a different note in the same song. He climbed a low embankment and pushed through the brittle trees until he found the source of the smoke. A small camp tucked beneath the overhang of a collapsed stone wall, where a man sat cross-legged beside a shallow fire pit, feeding it twigs and strips of paper torn from a book. The man looked up when he heard the branches rustle, but he didn't move. He had a face lined with age, though not from years alone. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes ringed with the same tired grey that lived in most grown-ups now. He wore a coat too big for him, sleeves rolled 3 times at the cuffs, and a scarf made from a torn flannel shirt wrapped around his neck twice. The boy didn't speak at first. He stood a few feet away, watching the fire, watching the man. He didn't want to ask. Asking felt too close to begging, and he hated how begging made his voice tremble. Instead, he just let his feet sink into the earth and waited. The man didn't shoo him off, didn't ask what he wanted. Instead, he reached into a dented coffee can and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He set it on the ground between them and nudged it gently forward. "Still warm," the man said, his voice dry like leaves, "but only just." The boy stepped closer, crouched, and opened the cloth. Inside were 2 small boiled potatoes, skins wrinkled and soft, steam barely rising from their middles. He looked up at the man, who only nodded once, then turned back to the fire. The boy picked up one of the potatoes and cradled it in both hands before taking a bite. The skin split easily beneath his teeth, and the inside was hot enough to burn his tongue just a little. He didn't care. He chewed slowly, savouring the salt and earth and heat, and the quiet moment where no one asked for anything. After a few minutes, the man spoke again. "Name's Ira," he said, still not looking at the boy. "Used to work on the lines, wiring telegraph poles. Not much call for that now." The boy nodded, swallowing the last of the potato. "I'm just me," he said, the same answer he'd given Lou. Ira didn't press. He tossed another handful of twigs onto the fire and leaned back against the wall behind him. "Cold's worse this year," he said. "Been drifting south, but even down there it's not much better." They sat in silence again, the fire popping softly, the smoke curling up into the bare limbs above. The second potato rested in the boy's lap, still wrapped in the cloth. He didn't eat it yet. He liked the weight of it there, the promise of more warmth, the idea that something waited for him, even if just for a few minutes longer. Ira glanced over once, then reached into his coat and pulled out a folded map, torn at the edges, dotted with tiny scribbles. He smoothed it on his knee and traced a finger along a faint red line. "There's a camp in Galveston," he murmured. "Word is they've got a kitchen. WPA fella's been sending down work crews." The boy didn't ask what WPA meant. It didn't matter. He knew what kitchen meant. He knew what camp meant. He knew how far it could feel between now and a maybe. They didn't speak much more. After a while, Ira dozed, head resting against the stones, the fire dwindling to a soft bed of coals. The boy finished the second potato, slow and careful, and folded the cloth before placing it back into the coffee can. Then he stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and looked down at Ira for a long moment. The man looked older asleep, softer somehow, and the boy felt a pang of something he didn't have words for. He turned and slipped back through the trees, retracing his steps past the creek and through the fields where the snow had begun to fall in light flakes, barely more than whispers. His boots left prints in the thin dusting, and for a moment he watched them one after the other, marking a path toward home, and behind him, in the stillness of a stranger's fire, a little warmth lingered. The snow didn't fall with drama. It came like a secret being passed between clouds and rooftops, soft and steady, barely visible until it began to gather in the corners of the windows and cling to fence posts like a layer of quiet breath. Boy walked through it without hurrying. Snow, when it came like this, seemed to slow everything around it. His footsteps pressed softly into the ground, not yet deep enough to stick, but leaving behind faint shadows that marked the trail back from the riverbank to the place he had once called his neighbourhood. Everything looked different under that veil of pale grey. The roofs of the half-collapsed barns now bore a soft crown of white. The brittle grass wore coats of frost. Even the telephone wires, still sagging uselessly between leaning poles, carried little strands of snow like thin ribbon. The boy tucked the strip of canvas tighter around his shoulders and walked with his head slightly down, eyes scanning the ground more from habit than hope. Sometimes snow disguised useful things. An old can, a piece of rope, a crust too stiff for rats. But today the only things it covered were rust and ruin. He passed the little church with the missing steeple. Someone had taken the bell months ago, and the wind had blown out one of the stained glass windows, leaving behind a jagged hole like a broken smile. The front steps creaked even when no one walked on them. Inside, the pews were still lined up in perfect order, waiting for sermons that never came. The boy stopped just past the gate and looked inside for a moment. He remembered sitting there once, legs swinging beneath the bench, listening to a hymn sung by women whose voices trembled but tried to be strong. His mother had held his hand then. She used to wear a brooch shaped like a little golden bird. He hadn't seen it in months. Maybe she'd traded it. Maybe she'd hidden it away. Maybe it had just disappeared, like so many things had. The wind shifted again, curling past his ears and stirring the snow into tiny eddies that danced briefly before falling back to the earth. His cheeks stung with the cold now, and his fingers had gone stiff inside the sleeves of his coat. He needed to move, to keep walking, to keep the blood from slowing. He cut across a narrow field, crunching over frozen soil, and followed the edge of a path that curved behind a row of abandoned houses. One of them, a small square place with a crumbling porch and a chimney that leaned like it was exhausted, had always been strange to him. Not scary, just hushed. Even the wind seemed to fall quiet there. No one had lived in it since the first year the factories closed, but its windows remained unbroken, and the door still hung straight. It was known in whispers as the Whisper House, though no one could say why. Maybe because no one ever heard anything come from inside, not even mice. The boy approached it now with a sense of curiosity more than fear. His legs were cold, and the wind had started to rise again. Just a minute inside, he thought. Just to warm up, just to catch his breath. The door creaked when he pushed it open, but not in the dramatic way of storybook-haunted places. It groaned like wood that hadn't been asked to move in a long while. Inside, the air was still, dry with the dust of forgotten time. The living room held a sagging couch, its stuffing long since chewed away, and a small table covered in a thin film of frost that had crept in through a broken window frame. There was a fireplace choked with ash and bits of broken brick. He knelt near it and ran a hand across the hearth. Cold, of course, but not unwelcoming. In the kitchen, he found the remains of a tin of flour, just enough dust at the bottom to leave a mark on his fingers. Next to it sat a small wooden bowl and a cast-iron pan that someone had clearly meant to take with them, but hadn't. He turned the pan over in his hands and then walked back to the living room, placing it gently on the hearth. He could almost see it, a fire lit, the pan warming, a bit of ash bread frying gently, thin and flat, but enough to ease the knot in his stomach. He gathered bits of broken furniture from the back room, a chair leg, a splintered shelf, and brought them back, stacking them carefully. It took time to get the flame going. His hands were clumsy with cold, and the matches he'd kept from Ira's camp were damp at the edges. But after a few failed attempts, the spark caught, and the kindling began to crackle. He huddled close, holding his hands out as the first threads of warmth found their way into his bones. The heat was weak, but real. It breathed life back into the room, slow and gentle. He stared into the flame, watching it flicker across the black walls of the fireplace, casting small shadows that danced across the floor. In that moment, the house didn't feel empty. It felt like it had been waiting for someone to sit there again, to wake the silence with a breath, to remember. He returned to the kitchen and shook the last bit of flour into the bowl, mixing it with snow melted from a pan placed near the flame. He stirred it with a stick and poured it thin into the cast iron. It hissed faintly, puffing up just a little around the edges. It was barely food, barely even a thing, but it was warm, and it was his. He ate slowly, savouring each bite. The texture was tough and the taste dry, but it filled the empty place for now, and that was all that mattered. When he finished, he sat back and listened to the fire burn down. He didn't feel like moving. The quiet in the house was comforting now, not eerie. It felt like the house had stories, and maybe, just maybe, it was grateful for the company. Eventually the flames dwindled, and the cold crept back in. He stood, wrapped the canvas back around his shoulders, and looked around the room one last time. There was a mirror on the far wall, cracked through the centre, but still intact enough to catch his reflection. He looked older in it here, not by years, but by weight. The kind of weight that settles in your eyes and stays there, even when the rest of you tries to stay small. He stepped back out into the snow, now falling more steadily, each flake soft and deliberate. The path had already begun to vanish behind him, his footprints softened by the wind. But he didn't look back. The house had given him something. Warmth, shelter, the memory of taste, and now it could rest again. He walked north, back toward the orchard and the field and the sagging shack where his mother waited, or slept, or simply endured. He didn't know what he would find when he returned, but he carried a little more heat inside him now, a little more strength in his legs, and in this world, that was enough to keep going. The snow had thickened by the time he made it back to the orchard. It no longer drifted like a whisper, but pressed down in wide, heavy flakes that blanketed the trees and softened the sound of his footsteps. The wind had settled for now, taking a long breath somewhere far off in the hills, and the world felt muted. There was a hush in the air that made the orchard seem less like a graveyard and more like a chapel, each tree a patient witness to whatever small hopes passed beneath its branches. His boots, damp from hours of walking, had started to pull at the soles again. The left one flapped now with every fourth step, and though he tried to shift his weight to avoid it, the limp crept back in without asking. Still he kept going, teeth clenched lightly not from pain but from the chill that kept worming its way deeper into his sleeves and collar. The canvas strip had frozen slightly along the edges, stiffening where it had caught the melt from his breath, and it tugged awkwardly at his shoulders, but it still kept the worst of the wind from finding his back, and for that he was grateful. As the shack came into view, he slowed, watching it through the falling snow. It looked smaller somehow, crouched there in the grove, sagging into itself as if trying to disappear beneath the weight of the sky. He paused at the edge of the clearing, one hand resting on the gnarled trunk of an apple tree, and squinted through the grey light. No movement, no smoke, just the familiar slump of roof and wall and the faded patchwork of old cloth fluttering at the doorway. He crossed the last few feet slowly, boots crunching softly, and pulled back the curtain to step inside. The cold in the shack was deep, settled into the walls and floor like a second skin. His mother hadn't stirred. She lay beneath the blanket in the same position he'd left her, her face half turned to the wall, hair spread out across the fabric like threads of ash. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim. Then he stepped closer and placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm. She opened her eyes after a moment, blinking slowly, lips parting as if she meant to say something, but had forgotten how. He crouched beside her and reached into the inner pocket of his coat, pulling out the last piece of ash bread he'd saved. He broke it into 2 pieces and pressed one into her hand. She didn't look at it, just held it for a long time before slowly raising it to her mouth. They ate in silence, chewing slowly, each bite lasting longer than it should. The bread was cold and tough now, but she didn't seem to notice. When they'd finished, he sat back against the wall, eyes half closed, feeling the chill seep through the floorboards. The quiet between them wasn't heavy, only worn thin by use, like an old blanket passed back and forth. After a while she spoke, her voice brittle and rasping like a branch across a window pane. She asked where he'd been, and he told her a little, about the man by the river, about the potatoes, about the fire. He left out the part about the house and the mirror and the cracked pan. Some things were too soft to share just yet, still warm inside him, and he didn't want them cooling too fast. She nodded once, then leaned her head back and closed her eyes. Her breathing evened out, not sleep but rest, and he sat watching the fireless stove as if he could will it to life. The stove was little more than a relic now, its belly cold and hollow. Once, long ago, it had roared. He remembered the sound of the door clanging shut, the smell of ash and bread and stew, that life felt like it belonged to someone else. The snow continued to fall outside, muffling the world, and soon the light began to fade. The shack grew darker, colder, but he didn't move. Movement felt like too large a thing. He stayed still until the shadows deepened and the room became a grey blur. Then he stood slowly, careful not to wake her, and stepped back outside into the evening. The air had turned sharper. He wrapped the canvas tighter and walked without thinking, not in search of anything this time, just needing to move. His legs carried him across the edge of the orchard and toward the open field that stretched past the old mill road. It had once been planted with wheat long ago, but now it lay bare, covered in snow and lined with the faint scars of plough marks that had not seen use in years. Halfway across he spotted a dark shape beneath one of the skeletal trees that bordered the field. As he drew closer, he saw that it was a box, or rather the remains of one, a crate broken and collapsed, but inside something glinted faintly. He crouched and brushed aside the snow. A metal tin lay wedged between 2 boards, the lid half pried open. Inside were matchbooks, dozens of them, the old kind with advertisements printed across the front. He picked one up, turning it over. The cover read Melvin's Shoe Repair, Tulsa, Another said Windsor Hotel, Kansas City. There were even a few with pictures, a smiling woman holding a bottle of cola, a tall glass of beer against a sunset, a circus elephant with stars on its hat. He took 3 matchbooks and tucked them into his coat, then paused. He looked around. There was no sign of anyone nearby, no footprints in the snow except his own. He left the rest of the tin where it was, hidden again beneath the broken boards. That was the way things were now. Take only what you need. Leave something for the next. He walked back across the field more slowly, letting his mind drift. Each match in his pocket felt like a promise, a small light for another cold night. He thought of Lou, of the stranger named Ira, of Miss Franny's nods and Ella's burnt rolls, all of them holding on, finding ways to give something even when they had nothing. As he neared the shack once more, the first real wind of the night began to rise. It came low and curling, pulling snow from the trees and flinging it across the path ahead. He ducked his head and pushed forward, reaching the door just as the curtain snapped against the frame. Inside, the air had grown even colder. His mother had drawn the blanket up to her chin and didn't stir as he entered. He knelt beside the stove and pulled out one of the matchbooks, fingers working quickly to strike the first flame. It flared, bright and warm, and for a moment lit the room in gold. He set it to a bit of dry bark he'd found beneath the orchard trees and watched the fire catch. Slowly the warmth began to return, curling out from the stove like a slow breath, and he leaned back, exhaling for the first time in what felt like hours. The night stretched out before them, silent and vast. But now, inside this little patch of cold wood and patched blankets, there was light. The warmth that rose from the stove was shallow at first, like the last breath of something once alive. It didn't flood the shack or chase the cold from every corner, but it reached the floor and the boy's knees and the edges of his mother's blanket, and that was enough. For now, he sat close to it, legs tucked beneath him, hand stretched towards the metal door where the flame crackled softly inside. The fire had caught well, burning through the dry bark and catching hold of the bits of torn sack and splintered twigs he'd fed it. It smelled faintly of ash and mould and something sour, but it was a good smell, the smell of heat in a place that rarely knew it. His mother stirred but didn't open her eyes. Her breath had steadied in the last hour, grown deeper, less like the ragged edge of sleep and more like something her body trusted. He didn't speak. The fire did the talking now. It popped quietly like the slow ticking of a soft-spoken clock, and the light flickered gently across the wooden walls, making their broken lines shimmer, like water. For the first time in what felt like days, he allowed his shoulders to lower. Not relax, not entirely, but loosen just enough to let the weight shift. The tension in his back eased. His hand stopped shaking. Even the steady ache behind his ribs, that cold gnawing that came when meals were too far apart and too thin to count, began to fade into a dull quiet. He pulled his knees closer and thought of the matchbook. Just 3 more. Each one could mean another fire. Another night like this. It felt like wealth, not the kind with coins or bills, but the kind that held the promise of survival. That kind of wealth didn't clink in pockets. It warmed your hands and softened the silence and let you close your eyes for a few minutes without dreaming of bare cupboards and padlocked store doors. Outside, the wind moved again, dragging snow across the orchard in loose, playful shapes. The trees creaked under the weight of it, and the branches scratched against each other, like tired hands reaching for something out of reach. The shack groaned once, a long, low moan from one of the roof beams. The boy looked up, then pressed the last of the dry wood into the stove and watched it catch. By morning the fire had gone to ash, but the stove still held a little warmth, enough to keep the frost from forming inside. He stood slowly, careful not to wake his mother, and stepped outside into the pale grey dawn. The snow had stopped, leaving a soft layer across everything. The orchard was blanketed in stillness, the ground smooth and unbroken, except for a few thin animal tracks weaving between the trees. He walked with purpose this time. He needed more wood, more kindling. The little piles behind the trees had been picked clean, but there were always scraps further out, past the fence line where an old barn had collapsed in on itself years ago. Most people didn't bother going that far, not in weather like this, but the boy knew the place well. It had been one of his hiding spots once, back when there was still something to hide from, and the world hadn't become one long echo of footsteps and waiting. The snow crunched underfoot as he moved, the cold stiffening his coat and biting at the tips of his ears. He kept his hands tucked inside the sleeves and breathed slowly, letting the chill slide past him without complaint. By the time he reached the barn, his feet were half numb, and the flapping sole of his boot had begun to leave an uneven trail behind him. The barn leaned like an old man caught mid-sneeze. Its roof caved in at one end, and the walls bowed inward, held together more by habit than nails. He ducked beneath a sagging beam and stepped carefully through the doorway, eyes adjusting to the dim light. Inside, the air was still and dry, the dust of years settling in thick layers across the broken tools and splintered crates. He began gathering what he could, bits of wood, old shingles, the dry spine of a shutter, anything that would burn. He worked quietly, stuffing them into the canvas strip and tying the ends together to form a makeshift sack. As he moved deeper into the barn, he spotted something strange near the back wall, half buried beneath a rusted wheelbarrow. He crouched and tugged it free. It was a ledger, thick and stained, its cover cracked from exposure. He turned it over in his hands, surprised at how heavy it felt. The pages inside were brittle, most of them charred along the edges, as if someone had tried to burn it but stopped halfway. Names were written in long, sloping letters, rows and rows of numbers, notations, columns of debts and payments and vanished totals. He stared at it for a long time, wondering what kind of world had once needed this many records, what kind of people had filled these pages with their hopes and failures. There was something mournful in it. He couldn't say why, just the weight of it, the way the ink had faded, the smudged fingerprints across the paper. He flipped to the back and found a pressed flower, brittle and colourless, folded between the pages. Someone had kept this once. Someone had meant something by it. He tucked it under his arm and finished gathering the wood. The snow had begun to fall again when he stepped outside, and the sky had gone a little darker, the wind stirring just enough to tug at his coat. He walked home slowly, careful with the bundle, the ledger pressing against his side like a forgotten memory. Back at the shack, he lit another match and fed the stove carefully, using smaller bits first, then the larger pieces. The flame caught again, warming the air just enough to keep the walls from biting. His mother was awake now, her eyes following his movements, though she still didn't speak. He set the bundle of wood beside the stove, then pulled out the ledger and placed it on the table. She looked at it for a long time, then reached out and touched the cover. Her fingers moved slowly over the cracked leather, as if recognizing something she couldn't name. She opened it, flipped a few pages, then closed it again. "From the mill," she said softly, voice hoarse. "They used to keep pay records there." He nodded, though he didn't understand. He just liked hearing her voice. It had been so long since it filled the room. She didn't say more. She folded her hands and stared at the fire, eyes distant. He sat beside her and leaned back against the wall. The warmth settled around them again, not strong but steady. And for now, that was all they needed. Outside, the wind returned and the trees bent low beneath the weight of the new snow. But inside there was light, and a little heat, and the quiet rhythm of two people still holding on. The next morning came slowly, wrapped in a thick layer of grey that didn't quite brighten into daylight but settled into something close enough. The snow had let up, though it still clung to the trees and rooftops, like it hadn't yet made up its mind whether it was staying or going. The shack was colder than it had been the night before. The fire had gone out sometime during the early hours, and the last bits of wood left beside the stove had grown damp from the icy breath that found its way through the wall seams. The boy stirred first, pushing the blanket aside, carefully so as not to wake his mother. Her breathing was shallow but even, and her lips looked less dry today, which gave him a small, reluctant hope. He moved quietly, slipping his boots on in slow practiced motions. The left boot was barely holding together now. The sole flapped so loose it nearly caught under his heel with every step, and a large crack had opened across the toe where the leather had given up. He tied a scrap of cloth across it, not to fix it, but to stop it from catching snow. It wouldn't hold long, but it would give him a little time. Outside, the cold wasn't biting anymore. It had softened just enough that the snow gave slightly beneath his feet, sinking instead of crunching. The orchard looked still and white, trees heavy with powder, like old women bowed beneath their shawls. He made his way through them in silence, heading toward the town, hoping Miss Franny would be out early. Sometimes on mornings like this, when the sky felt too still, she brought out her little table and set up slow just for something to do. The boy didn't have anything to offer, not today, but sometimes she let him help unload or sweep snow from the cloth-covered table, and in return he might get the corner of a biscuit or a bruised apple or a half-pint jar of lard too old for paying customers. The walk felt longer than usual, maybe because his legs ached from the wood gathering, or maybe because the cold was finding its way back into the bones of the town. When he reached Main Street, he saw the usual scene, most shop windows fogged with condensation, signs hanging crookedly, doors bolted or loosely propped open with crates that hadn't seen fresh goods in weeks. The grocer had his shutters drawn. The drugstore still had the poster of cough syrup peeling slowly from the window, and the post office looked like no one had passed through it in days. But there was Franny, her little folding table already out beneath the awning of the old bakery, her hands wrapped in fingerless gloves, arranging small jars and wrapped parcels with a kind of slow grace. She didn't look up at first, and the boy approached quietly, watching the steam curl up from the thermos she'd brought to warm her fingers between arrangements. "Morning, Miss Franny," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned her head slightly and gave him a look that was neither surprised nor stern, just measured. Then her face softened a little, and she nodded toward the cloth draped over a small crate near her feet. "You're earlier than the frost," she said, voice scratchy but kind. "Sit a while if your bones can take it." He sat, careful not to knock over the crate. His legs folded beneath him easily, and he tucked his hands beneath his arms, trying to draw some of the thermos heat into his skin just by being near it. Franny didn't ask if he was hungry, she never did. Instead, she slid a small packet across the table, wrapped in wax paper and tied with string. "Ends of bread," she said. "Got too tough for chewing, but they'll stew all right." He took the parcel without speaking. The bread was hard in his hands, but not frozen. He imagined softening it in melted snow and frying it against the side of the stove, watching it swell just enough to pretend it was full. Franny sat back and looked out at the street. A few other figures passed by, heads low, shoulders hunched against a wind that hadn't yet risen. The town was quieter now, like each storm pulled another layer of life away, but Miss Franny remained. She always had. Some said she had once been married. Others said she had inherited the bakery from a cousin who died in the flu. No one really knew. The only thing everyone agreed on was that she showed up when others didn't. "You look like you've seen something," she said after a long pause, still watching the street. He glanced down at the bread in his lap, then at her face. "I found a book," he said. "Ledger from the mill. Burnt, mostly. Names and numbers." She didn't speak right away, then she gave a slow nod, as though turning something over in her mind. "Used to keep those locked up," she said. "Back before the bank came knocking. Folks liked their names in ink when it meant pay. Not so much when it meant debt." The boy said nothing. He didn't know much about money, only what its absence felt like. He knew that it kept doors closed and plates empty. He knew that it turned people's faces tight and quiet. Franny reached beneath the table and pulled out a small tin box. She opened it slowly and drew out a single match, striking it against the box's side. She lit a small lantern at the corner of the table, though the sun had begun to rise properly now, and there was hardly need for it. "Sometimes the flame's more for show than light," she said, seeing the way he watched. "Makes folks feel like something's still burning." He understood. There were fires that warmed and fires that told stories, and both were worth having when the world grew thin. They sat like that for a while longer, him holding the bread, her rearranging a few jars of preserves no one could afford. The boy finally stood, nodding a quiet thank you. Before he left, Franny handed him something else, a small piece of twine wrapped around a bundle of newspaper pages, soft from handling. Some onions, strong ones. Make your eyes hurt, but they'll flavour the bread. He took it and tucked it beneath his coat, and she gave him one last look before turning back to her jar. The walk home felt shorter, maybe because the parcel warmed his chest, or maybe because his legs had decided to stop complaining. The wind picked up just a little as he reached the orchard, but it carried the scent of pine and earth and something else, maybe old smoke or frost-burnt leaves. It wasn't unpleasant. Back at the shack, his mother was sitting up for the first time in days. Her eyes were clearer, and her fingers moved more surely as she adjusted the blanket. She didn't speak, but he could see in her face that she'd waited for him, watched the doorway in that way mothers always did, even when they had no strength to call out. He knelt beside the stove and struck one of the matchbooks. The flame flickered, then held. He fed the fire slowly, tenderly, as if it were a living thing in need of encouragement. Then he unwrapped the bread and the onions and placed them on the flat stone near the heat. The bread softened. The onions hissed faintly as he pressed them against the pan. The room filled with their scent, sharp and comforting, like something rich even though it wasn't. They ate in silence, a silence that felt less like emptiness and more like reverence. Each bite carried weight, not because of the taste, but because of what it represented. Another day, another small miracle carved from the dust of what used to be. The broken clock on the shelf ticked once, though it hadn't in weeks, just once. Then it fell still again. That night, after the onion warmth had settled in their bellies and the stove had dimmed into quiet embers, the boy lay with his head resting against the folded coat, listening to the slow creak of the wind against the walls. His mother had drifted off before him, her breathing steady and low, chest rising in a rhythm that no longer sounded as laboured as it had a week ago. The fire still gave off a dull glow from behind the stove door, and it was just enough to let his eyes trace the lines of the shack ceilings above him, the way the wood warped inward, slanting towards the centre, like it, too, was always bowing under the weight of time. He wasn't quite tired yet, not tired in the way sleep could reach. There was too much still playing behind his eyes. The smell of the onion, strong and savoury, how Franny's hands had wrapped that paper parcel so tightly, the way the burnt ledger had made his mother's eyes grow distant but not empty. These thoughts didn't race, they drifted. They floated up and lingered, not demanding answers, just asking to be noticed. He let them come and go, until even the edges of his thoughts began to blur, and the fire fell completely into silence. In the morning the light came clearer, not bright, not warm, but real. The sky above the orchard had cleared overnight, and a faint sun hovered behind a pale blue wash, just enough to melt the snow off the upper branches of the apple trees. Water dripped softly from the limbs, pattering onto the ground like small applause. It was the kind of morning that hinted spring might remember them soon, even if only in a whisper. The boy stood and stretched his arms slowly, joints cracking like twigs, then reached for the coat again. The bread was gone and the onions eaten, and the last of the wood was down to splinters too fine to feed a fire. He needed to find more, maybe at the edge of the orchard, maybe near the train line. There were always bits of old crates left behind where men had slept and moved on. Before he left, he glanced at the shelf above the door. The clock still sat there, silent. It had ticked once, just once. He wondered if that was its farewell or its promise. He stepped outside, the air crisp and still. The snow had hardened overnight and now broke softly beneath his boots. Each step left a faint crunch, but the sound felt gentle, as if the earth were sighing rather than cracking. He moved past the orchard fence and followed the path down toward the road where the mailboxes sat. Most hadn't seen letters in months. The rust had spread across their sides, and the lids hung crooked or frozen shut. But the one nearest the gate, the one marked 237 in faded black paint, had always had a stubbornness to it. It remained straight, upright, its lid still closing with a soft, clean click. The boy never expected anything to be there. Mail wasn't for people like them anymore. Bill stopped coming when people stopped having addresses that mattered, but still he opened the box every few days, a quiet habit, part curiosity and part defiance, as if the simple act of checking made the world seem slightly more normal. Today there was something inside. It wasn't a letter, not really, just a small folded piece of brown paper, weighted by a stone the size of a walnut. The paper was creased sharply, like someone had taken the time to make sure it fit just right. He pulled it out slowly, eyes scanning the road, but there was no one in sight, just snow, trees, and the low whisper of wind through the fence rails. He unfolded the paper. Inside, in neat handwriting that sloped slightly to the right, were 6 words. Wagon comes Wednesday. South of tracks. No name, no signature, no explanation. Just those words. Written carefully, like the writer had repeated them silently while writing, as if rehearsing a secret before letting it go. The boy turned the message over, checking for more. Nothing. He stared at it for a moment longer, then tucked it inside his coat. It might have been meant for someone else, but it had been placed in that box, and nobody else checked that box now. That much he knew, south of the tracks. That meant the old station, the place where freight used to stop when this town had something worth receiving. It hadn't seen a real train in months, maybe longer, but wagons still passed through now and then, families drifting from one empty promise to another. Sometimes trucks, if the driver had been paid enough to look the other way. He turned back toward the shack, mind turning slowly over the note. If someone was leaving supplies, or trading, or even just passing through, it might mean something, or it might mean nothing, but nothing had become too common lately. Maybe it was time to lean into something uncertain. He reached the shack and sat beside the stove, lighting one of the last 2 matches. The tiny flame danced quickly, catching on the thin bits of bark he'd found beneath the fence, and he fed it slowly, letting it grow. His mother watched from the blanket, her eyes alert but unreadable. He showed her the note. She didn't react, not with words, just nodded once, barely, and then closed her eyes again. Not approval, not disapproval, just acknowledgement. That night, he didn't sleep deeply. He lay on his side, staring at the wall, thinking of wagons and messages and the odd familiarness of the handwriting. Someone had taken the time to fold that note. Someone had placed it in the mailbox. It was meant for someone. It could be meant for them. When morning came, he was already dressed. The coat wrapped twice around him, the last piece of onion scent lingering in the fabric. He didn't wake his mother. She'd stirred already, her breathing even, hands tucked beneath the blanket. She knew he was going. She didn't stop him. He followed the path past the orchard and down the main road, then veered off near the old flour mill and through the wide patch of field that sloped gently down toward the train tracks. The station appeared slowly, its roof bowed in the middle, shingles missing, windows long broken out. It stood like a forgotten shrine to movement, empty benches inside, timetables still nailed to the wall, dates from 2 seasons ago. He waited near the southern edge, where the gravel road crossed just shy of the loading dock. Snow had drifted here, forming uneven mounds that made walking slow. He stood in the shade of a low pine tree, hands in his coat, eyes scanning the road. The sun had risen a little, turning the sky into a pale curtain of dull silver. The air smelled faintly of horses and hay. He heard the wagon before he saw it. The wheels groaned against the frozen ground. A slow wooden rumble, then the rhythmic clop of hooves. Around the bend came an old cart drawn by a thin brown mare. The man driving it hunched forward, face half hidden by a scarf. He pulled the reins gently as he approached the station, then stopped just past the loading dock. He didn't speak at first, just looked. The boy stepped forward slowly, one hand raised, not waving, not hailing, just making himself known. The man on the cart reached behind him and drew out a bundle wrapped in thick cloth. He set it on the edge of the wagon, then nodded once and flicked the reins. The mare moved forward again, slow and deliberate, the wagon creaking as it vanished down the road without another word. The boy waited until the wagon was gone, then stepped to the bundle. It was tied with rope, coarse but clean, and inside was a small loaf of bread, a bottle of milk wrapped in straw, and a length of rope coiled like a sleeping snake. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just picked it up, held it close, and turned toward home. Behind him the station stood silent, but the mailbox had spoken, and in this world that meant something. The boy carried the bundle close against his chest as he walked back through the orchard, each step sinking softly into the thin snow, the warmth of what he carried already beginning to bleed into his ribs. The bottle of milk had stayed warm beneath its wrapping of straw, a quiet miracle in the cold. He held it like something fragile and sacred, cradled beneath his coat, letting its weight remind him that sometimes the world gave without taking first. The bread, too, had shape and softness to it, not the brittle sort that crumbled at first touch, but a real loaf, firm and golden with flour still caught in the cracks. He couldn't remember the last time he'd held something so substantial. It felt heavier than its size, as if all the hunger of the weeks behind him pressed against it now, making it more than just food. The sun was slanting low behind the trees as he reached the shack, casting long shadows through the orchard, each trunk like a tall, tired figure leaning just slightly forward. He stepped lightly through the doorway, careful not to let the cold follow too far inside. His mother was awake, propped up against the wall now, her blanket drawn to her chin. Her face looked less hollow in the afternoon light, though her eyes still carried the distant look of someone balancing between presence and retreat. She glanced up when he entered, and her eyes fixed on the bundle in his arms. He didn't speak, just knelt beside the stove and began unwrapping it. The rope came off first, then the cloth, folded back with a kind of reverence that surprised even him. The bottle of milk sat nestled in its cushion, and the bread, whole and honest, sat like something ceremonial. He held it up and looked at her. She nodded slowly once, and pulled the blanket down from her mouth. "Warm it," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't rasp today. It carried. He sliced the bread with the edge of a can lid, sawing carefully through the crust. Each slice came uneven, but solid. He poured a bit of the milk into the tin pan, then set the slices on top, letting them soak for a moment before placing the whole thing onto the flat stone atop the stove. The fire inside was small, fed by leftover scraps he'd saved the night before, but it was enough. As the bread began to heat, a faint steam rose up, carrying with it a smell so raw and familiar he nearly lost his balance. His mother's eyes followed the motion of his hands. When he offered her the first piece, she took it with both hands and pressed it to her lips before taking a bite. He watched her chew slowly, her throat working carefully, her eyes closing for a brief moment. Then he took his own piece and ate with the same quiet intensity, tasting not just the bread and milk, but the memory of every day that hadn't had either. They didn't talk. There was nothing to say that would make more sense than the warmth in their bellies, or the way the shack no longer felt like a grave for breath. He didn't ask who had sent the bundle or why. The note had said enough. Someone at outs. They still watched, still remembered that this orchard, this shack, this boy and his mother were not yet folded into the silence. Someone had chosen to place something in a rusted mailbox and send it with hope into a house that had long stopped expecting kindness. Later, when the sun had dipped fully behind the horizon and the stars had begun their slow shimmer into the sky, he sat at the doorway with the rope coiled beside him. He turned it over in his hands, fingering the strands, wondering what use it had been meant for. It wasn't long enough to tie anything serious, not strong enough to pull much weight, but it was clean and tight and new, a gift, perhaps, or a sign. Rope, in lean times, meant something more than its material. It meant security, the ability to hold things together, to lash what might fall apart. He leaned back against the frame and looked out across the orchard. A few of the trees had begun to shed their snow. The dripping water marked the night like a slow metronome. It occurred to him that time had shifted, not just in hours or days, but in shape. The way hunger had bent time into something long and thin, stretching moments into eternities and shortening days into flashes of necessity. But now, with a full stomach, time felt wider again. The minutes didn't slip through his hands. They held still, let him look at them. His mother had fallen asleep again. Her face looked more relaxed in the dim firelight. The tightness around her eyes softened. He watched her chest rise and fall steady and quiet. She didn't stir when he stood and stepped outside again, rope still in hand. He walked back toward the fence, toward the edge of the orchard, where the trees began to thin and the land sloped down into open field. There was a stump there, split long ago by lightning, its trunk charred black in the centre. It had always seemed like a marker of sorts, a boundary between the orchard and whatever came after. He crouched beside it now and began tying the rope between two low branches, fashioning a sort of line. He didn't know exactly why, only that he needed to do something. He needed to place a sign back into the world to answer whatever kindness had been left in that mailbox. When the line was secure, he took the cloth that had wrapped the bundle and folded it once, then hung it from the rope like a flag. It flapped gently in the breeze, its movement slight but clear. He stood back and looked at it, wondering if anyone would see. Maybe the man with the wagon would pass again. Maybe someone else would come. Or maybe it would just wave there for a while. A quiet proof that something had passed through here and left more than footprints. He returned to the shack just as the cold began to thicken again. The fire was low, but not out. He added a few scraps to it, warming his fingers before crawling beneath the blanket beside his mother. She stirred, just barely, and then settled again, her hand brushing against his in her sleep. The night held no dreams for him, only rest. And in this world that was a rare and precious thing. Morning returned with a quietness that felt earned, as though the night had pressed down just enough to smother all noise but spared a little stillness to leave behind. The boy woke slowly, one eye cracking open to the pale haze of dawn slipping through the seams in the wall. The stove had gone cold again, though not entirely. A faint warmth clung to the metal, like an ember had refused to die completely and was curled deep in its belly, waiting. He rolled to his side, the blanket pulling tight across his back, and for a moment he didn't move. There was something sweet in the way his limbs didn't ache, something easy about the way his stomach only stirred gently instead of curling into itself. He let the moment linger. A luxury, really. His mother was still sleeping. Her breath came soft and regular, and her brow looked smooth, not puckered the way it got when she was cold or hurting. He watched her a little longer, not out of worry, but in gratitude. Just seeing her like that, wrapped in stillness, made the shack feel less like a cage and more like a shelter. There was power in that shift, subtle as it was. Eventually he rose, pulling on his coat and boots, careful with the left one, where the sole now held only by threadbare will. The snow outside had melted in patches, revealing dark, wet earth in uneven circles beneath the trees. The orchard looked like it was sighing in relief, like the trees themselves had tired of bearing the white weight and were sloughing it off in slow surrender. Water dripped from every branch, steady and rhythmic, soaking into the ground, reminding the soil of its purpose. The boy walked the path toward the stump with the cloth flag. It still fluttered, slow and soft, like a sleeping breath. No footprints nearby, no sign of visitors, but that didn't surprise him. Messages like this one weren't always answered quickly. The world moved on its own time now, measured not in hours, but in moments of grace and their long waiting silences. He turned back, heading toward the barn. He hadn't looked through the rest of it since finding the ledger and the firewood. Something tugged at him about that book, the way his mother had recognized it without surprise, as though she had been waiting for it to come home. He crossed the broken threshold and stepped inside, the cold air thick with the smell of old hay and rust. The light from the slatted walls sliced across the floor in neat stripes, dust dancing in the beams. The ledger was where he'd left it on the work table, the cracked cover still curled up at the edge, spine fraying in 3 places. He opened it again, flipping through the brittle pages slowly, careful not to tear them. The writing was neat, practiced, almost delicate in its structure. Someone had cared about keeping these records clear, line after line of names, dates, numbers, credits and debts, paid. Some entries crossed out with dark lines, others underlined. In the back, a few pages had been torn, only stubs left where names might have been. He ran his fingers over them, imagining what had once been written there. Then he saw it. Near the middle of the book, on a page that looked a little more smudged than the rest, was his mother's name. Written plainly, the way names often are when no one expects them to matter to anyone else. A single entry beside it, a few numbers, a date, a line that didn't go on, no cross-out, no update, just left open, like someone had meant to come back to it and never did. He stared at it for a long time. He didn't fully understand the numbers, but he knew the weight of them. Owed, most likely. Borrowed maybe. Or maybe just a mark. A note that someone had once seen her and recorded it, given her a line in something that was supposed to last. He closed the ledger gently and looked around the barn again. There were signs of others having passed through. A broken lantern on the floor, an empty can of beans tucked near a rafter, a bit of blanket used as a curtain across one of the inner stalls. These weren't his marks, but he understood them. People leaving behind traces, small efforts to make a place just barely habitable. The barn was a kind of memory bank, not just for the town, but for all the drifting souls who'd rested here briefly before disappearing back into the wind. He stepped outside, the light sharper now. It caught on the melting snow and made everything glisten, as though the orchard had been painted in silver threads. He walked slowly back towards the shack, the ledger under his arm. When he arrived, his mother was awake, sitting with her back against the wall, hands folded loosely in her lap. Her eyes followed him as he entered, then dropped to the book he carried. He sat beside her and placed it on the blanket between them. She didn't reach for it right away, just looked. Then she placed a hand lightly on the cover, fingers tracing the edge of the binding like she was remembering something long buried. "Your father used to keep it," she said quietly, not looking at him. "Wrote in it every night. Not just work records, everything. Thoughts, worries, prayers maybe. That was before the mill closed, before he went looking for something better." The boy listened. Her voice was thin but steady. "I thought it was burned," she said, "when they cleared the building out. But maybe someone saved it. Maybe someone knew it mattered." She opened the book and turned to the page with her name. Her eyes moved slowly over the entry, then she closed it again and placed her hand flat on the cover. "It was never about the money," she said. "He just wanted to remember who we were, who we tried to be." They sat in silence after that, the book resting between them, the stove clicking softly as the last of the embers faded. Outside, a breeze rustled through the orchard, shaking, loose another wave of melting snow. The sky had cleared to a pale blue, and somewhere beyond the hills, birds were beginning to stir. Later, he tucked the ledger into a small space behind the wall slats, above where the stovepipe bent outward. A dry spot. Safe. It didn't need to be read again just yet, it just needed to be kept. And that night, as the stars stretched wide across the sky and the cold slipped in under the door once more, the boy lay beside his mother and listened to the quiet heartbeat of the shack. There was no bread left, no milk, but there had been both. And there was still firewood stacked in the corner. There were still 2 matches. There was still something left to wake up for. The wind was louder the next morning. Not howling, but persistent, the kind of wind that didn't need to scream because it knew it would eventually be heard. It came in low and steady, nudging the shack's walls as if testing their strength, whispering through the gaps in the wood like it had questioned no one had the energy to answer. The boy woke to it brushing across his cheek, a thin draught curling around his head, where the blanket had slipped back during the night. He pulled it tighter around his shoulders and lay there for a moment, listening, letting the wind talk while the rest of the world remained still. His mother was still asleep, and her breath was slow, the kind of breath that suggested rest rather than illness. He felt the shift in her without needing to speak to her. Something about the bread and the milk, and maybe even the simple act of warming her hands, had pulled her body a little closer back toward itself. He knew she wasn't well, Not in the way that healed with time and soup alone, but she was more present now. She was tethered, and that was enough to start the day with. He sat up and stared at the stove, the black metal now cool and dull. The fire was gone, of course. He had one match left. Just one, and only a few scraps of kindling no thicker than fingers. He thought about using it, feeding the last spark of flame into the small belly of the stove. But he didn't. Not yet. He didn't want to waste it on a morning that could be survived without it. Not when another cold snap might come, the kind that shrank the sky and turned breath into mists before it even left the mouth. Instead, he stood and stepped outside, the coat wrapped tightly around him, the sleeves too long now, his arms thinner than they had been when winter started. The orchard looked unfamiliar in the morning light, the trees shifting with the wind, branches tapping against each other like gossiping old neighbours. The snow was thinner again, retreating into the roots, revealing dark earth and the dead grass flattened beneath. He moved quietly, his boots catching on patches of exposed stone as he crossed toward the old fence line. There was something in the air, not scent exactly, more like a feeling, a restlessness. He paused near the stump where the cloth still hung, though it had twisted now, caught by the wind and pulled halfway off the rope. He untied it and folded it neatly, pressing it into his coat pocket. No need to draw attention if no one was looking. Further down the orchard path, near the bend where the trees gave way to a wide open stretch of field, he heard voices. Not close, not loud, but there, just under the sound of the wind. He crouched low and listened. The breeze carried the sound in waves, lifting and breaking like water lapping against wood. He heard a laugh, soft and low, then a word or two, indistinct, but unmistakably human. He moved slowly toward the sound, weaving between the trees, feet quiet against the thawing ground. The voices grew clearer, not in words but in tone, the rhythm of speech, the cadence of familiarity. Someone was talking, maybe more than one. He stopped near a wide old apple tree, one of the few still standing tall and thick, and leaned into the bark, listening with his whole body. The voices belonged to two men, older by their sound. Not drunk, not careless, but not cautious either. They spoke like people who knew no one was supposed to hear them, which made their presence strange. No one wandered through this orchard unless they had to. And even then they moved quickly, heads down, eyes on the ground. These men, whoever they were taking their time. He peered around the trunk, careful not to snap a branch underfoot. They were standing near the edge of the field, beside a small wooden cart, the kind pulled by hand rather than horse. It was half filled with what looked like tools, metal scraps, maybe even canned goods. The men wore coats darker than the trees behind them, and their breath came out in thick white puffs. One of them bent to adjust something in the cart while the other lit a cigarette with cupped hands, the match flaring briefly against the morning dull. The boy watched for a long while. They didn't seem dangerous, not obviously, but they didn't look like they belonged either, not to this orchard, not to this part of the land. Their boots were too new, the way they moved too sure. Travellers, perhaps, or traders, or something else entirely. He waited until they began to turn back towards the road, wheeling the cart slowly between them, their conversation fading again into the wind. Then he stepped out from the trees and followed at a distance, keeping low, letting the branches shield him. He wasn't afraid, just wary. The world had taught him to be slow with strangers. They stopped once near the crossroads, setting the cart down and unwrapping something from a cloth bundle. One of them took a bite, the other poured water from a flask into a tin cup. They sat on the edge of the ditch and ate without rush. He heard one of them mention a name, Mrs. Tellman, then something about the South Road and the fence near the Black Dog's farm, the kind of talk that locals used. But he didn't know the name, and he hadn't seen a Formosu Black Dog in months. After they finished, they stood, adjusted the cart again, and continued down the road. The boy waited until they were out of sight before stepping into the spot where they'd eaten. A crust of bread sat discarded on the ground, and a bit of cheese, hard at the edge. He picked them both up, wiped the snow from the surface, and held them in his hands like prizes. Then he turned and made his way back toward the shack, mind turning over everything he'd heard. By the time he returned, the wind had eased, and the sky had shifted to that pale, blank light that came before noon. His mother was still resting, her eyes half open, watching the doorway like she knew he had come back. He handed her the cheese and broke the bread in half, sharing it between them. He told her about the men, about the cart and the tools, and the way they talked like they had plans. She listened without interrupting, her gaze steady. "Traders, maybe," she said finally, "or scavengers." He nodded. It didn't really matter what they were, only that they existed, that someone else was out there, moving, doing, leaving traces behind. That night, after the stars pushed through the thinning clouds and the orchard went still again, the boy lay awake longer than usual, thinking about those voices. They had been ordinary voices, not cruel or kind, but real. And real things were rare enough to matter. He promised himself that next time, if he heard them again, he'd speak. He'd let the wind carry his voice too. The boy did not see the men again, though he looked for signs of their return each morning. He walked farther along the orchard's edge, sometimes going beyond the trees into the open stretch where the road began to lose itself in long lines of dust and patches of worn grass. Nothing ever looked different. No wheel ruts in the mud, no cigarette butts, no voices caught on the wind like before. The spot where they'd sat near the ditch had dried out in the sun, and the last crumbs of bread were long gone, scattered by birds or swept away by the restless air. But still he searched, and in doing so he noticed things he hadn't before. There were more footprints now, faint, older, but different from his own. A few deeper than others, like someone had stood still for a long time. And once, near the fence that ran along the west side of the orchard, he found a tin can turned on its side. Not a food can, but the kind used for nails. He picked it up, shook it gently, and heard the rattle of metal. Inside were 6 nails, clean, mostly unused. Their edges still sharp, their heads unbent. He didn't know much about carpentry, but he knew nails were rare enough these days to be something close to treasure. He brought the tin back with him and tucked it beside the ledger, wrapping it in an old handkerchief to keep the cold from biting the metal and turning it brittle. It sat there like a quiet offering, something he might need later, something he might trade, or build with. The idea of building anything felt absurd at first. He could barely keep the shack patched, let alone think about making something new. But still, the thought planted itself. Not a plan, just a seed. That afternoon, while his mother rested, he took the ledger down again and opened it to the last few pages, where the names had stopped, and the ink had thinned. These pages were less orderly, more like scraps of thought. Short notes, incomplete lists. One page had only 2 words written on it. Hinge splits. Another, in faded pencil, read, "Need rope. Enough for pull." He flipped carefully through these fragments, piecing together nothing clear but sensing something behind them. A mind trying to stay afloat in the weight of a crumbling world. Someone like him, like them. He reached the last page and paused. Tucked between it and the back cover was something thin and folded. Not part of the ledger itself. He slipped it free and unfolded it slowly, his fingers moving with the kind of care one uses when unwrapping something delicate. It was a letter, not sealed, just folded into itself. The paper was yellowed but smooth, and the handwriting was different from the rest of the book. Finer, more rounded. Not his father's hand, not Franny's. A woman's hand, maybe. He wasn't sure how he knew, he just did. The letter was short. To whoever holds this now, the cold won't stop, not this year. The fires are small and there's no more fat to burn. I've saved what I could, but this place is louder with ghosts now than it is with breath. If you find this, know we tried. We loved, even when it hurt, even when it was quiet and hard and without end. There's still kindness here. It's buried, but it's not gone. Don't forget us. There was no name, no date, just those words, pressed into the paper, like someone had written them while the world was slipping through their hands. He read it again, and then again, and then he folded it back into place and slid it between the wall slats beside the ledger, placing the tin of nails on top like a weight to hold the memory in place. The shack was silent when he returned to the floor beside his mother. She was sleeping again, her face turned toward the corner, a strand of hair stuck to her cheek with the damp of breath. He didn't wake her. He sat beside the stove and placed his hands around its sides, pretending it held more heat than it did. The final match was still tucked inside the matchbook, its head red and perfect. He traced its edge with his thumb but didn't strike it, not yet. That night, after the sky had gone fully dark and the stars peeked through the thinning clouds, he stepped outside once more. The cold had returned, sharp but not cruel. The trees whispered again, branches swaying against each other in conversation. He walked to the edge of the orchard and looked down the road where the men had gone. It was empty, but he spoke into the night anyway. "Thank you." "You," he said, not loudly, not like a shout, but clearly. "Whoever you are." Then he turned and walked back, the weight of the tin of nails in his thoughts, the letter still unfolding in the silence behind his eyes. There was no magic in it, no miracle, but there was something real. And in a season like this, that was enough. The days folded into one another the way winter days tend to do, with no real line between morning and afternoon, no hard edges to separate one cold breath from the next. The boy found himself moving through them like someone walking in shallow water. Everything slowed just slightly, the light dragging across the orchard in long streaks that never warmed the bark. It was not the kind of cold that bit or bruised. It was the kind that waited, the kind that watched you from the corners of a sagging sky and reminded you that even silence could press down like weight. The shack held, but just barely. The left wall had started to lean in places, the boards swelling and shifting with the damp, and one of the hinges on the door groaned each time he pushed it open, like it wanted to give out but hadn't decided how. He had tried stuffing bits of cloth and paper into the worst gaps, patching where he could with flattened tin and nails pried from old apple crates. But he was running out of cloth and tin, and the nails were too precious to spend without thought. The tin of nails he'd found near the edge of the orchard still sat beside the ledger, untouched. He had opened it once, picked one up, held it between his fingers and studied its smooth weight, but he had not used any yet, not until he knew where it mattered most. That morning the wind had returned with more insistence, curling around the corners of the shack and slipping through the wood like a whisper. He had managed to light a small fire using the last scraps of bark he'd kept dry, careful with the flame, coaxing it like it might refuse to live if he asked too much of it. His mother stirred only briefly as the heat crept through the room. Her skin looked less pale now, touched faintly with the blush of warmth, and her hands no longer curled against her chest like claws. She slept longer these days, but her sleep had changed. It wasn't the hollow stillness of sickness, but something deeper, something almost like trust. The boy wrapped his coat around himself and stepped outside with the broken hinge in mind. The door had needed tending for weeks. Every time he opened it, it sagged a little more, dragging across the uneven floor, and now one of the screws had worked its way loose, the whole thing pulling at the wood frame like a bad tooth. If it fell, the shack would be left exposed, not to the cold alone, but to everything. He couldn't let that happen. He stepped around the side of the building and knelt beside the frame, running his fingers along the edge where the hinge met the door. The wood was splintering there, thin and dry, crumbling at the edges. It needed more than just a new nail. It needed to be anchored again, the whole structure reminded of its purpose. He leaned back and looked toward the barn. The barn had stood longer than it should have. Its frame bowed but unbroken, its bones held together by rust and memory. He hadn't explored it fully, not since the day he found the ledger, but now he wondered if there might be something more useful still tucked away in its shadows. A strip of metal, a length of wire, even a discarded board that hadn't rotted all the way through. Inside, the light came in slanted beams, dust hanging thick where the sun pierced through broken boards. He moved slowly, eyes scanning each corner, listening for anything that didn't belong. Birds, maybe, or something larger. But it was quiet except for the soft settling of the rafters. He stepped over a fallen barrel and pushed aside a tarp that had long since stiffened into shape. Beneath it lay a pile of boards, some cracked, some bent, but one near the bottom looked solid. He tugged it free, brushing off the dirt and cobwebs. It was warped at one end, but clean at the centre, still strong. He carried it back to the shack, propped it against the wall, then stepped inside and took the tin of nails from its place beside the ledger. He chose 2 of the cleanest ones and slid them into his coat pocket, then took the last sliver of rope he had salvaged from the wagon bundle and looped it over his shoulder. He worked in silence, not because he needed quiet, but because quiet had become his way of asking the world not to shift too fast beneath him. He pressed the board against the inside frame of the door, holding it steady with his knee as he drove the first nail in. The sound echoed through the shack, a deep thud that felt almost intrusive. His mother stirred but did not wake. He paused, waited, then continued. The second nail bit deep, holding fast. The board settled flush, and he tied the rope across the door's top corner, anchoring it to the window frame so the weight would distribute evenly. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't even proper, but it held. When he stepped back and tested the door, it moved without sagging. The groan was softer now, the frame no longer protesting with every push. It was enough to make him breathe differently, to let his shoulders relax in a way they hadn't in weeks. He sat beside the stove again, holding his hands close to the small flame, watching it flicker and stretch. He had one more nail left on the table, and he turned it over in his palm, the metal cool and sure. He thought of the letter again, of the woman who'd written it. Her words pressed into that fragile paper like a prayer meant not to be answered, but simply remembered. "There's still kindness here," she had written, and he believed her. Outside, the wind began to shift, no longer pushing but circling, carrying with it the scent of something unfamiliar. Not smoke, not snow, something warm. He stood and stepped to the doorway, pushing it open gently. Across the orchard, far near the edge of the hill, where the trees thinned and the road curved down into the valley, there was a trail of smoke rising, thin and grey. It wasn't close, but it was real. Someone had made a fire. Someone else had placed warmth into the world. He didn't move toward it, not yet. He simply watched. Let the smoke tell its story. It might be travellers. It might be the men with the cart come back, or it might be someone new. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he wasn't alone. Back inside, his mother was awake. She watched him from the corner of the room, her eyes calm. "The door sounds different," she said, voice rasping like dry leaves. "I fixed it," he answered. She smiled just faintly. "It used to stick even when your father built it." He smiled too, then crossed to her side and sat on the floor, leaning against the wall with his knees pulled to his chest. They didn't talk much after that, just listened to the wind moving across the orchard and the faint sound of the trees adjusting to the change in air. Somewhere out there, someone was lighting fires, and here, inside their little wooden box, something had been repaired. Not just the hinge, not just the door, but something quieter, something deeper. The smoke lingered well into the evening, thin at first, just a finger against the sky, but growing thicker as the sun began to lower behind the distant ridge. It coiled gently upward, unbothered by the breeze, swaying like a quiet signal. The boy sat outside the shack and watched it from across the orchard, his arms wrapped around his knees, his chin resting lightly atop them. He hadn't said anything to his mother about it. Not yet. She had drifted off into another nap, her face slack with the kind of sleep that comes when a body begins to trust warmth again. It had taken days, maybe more, but she was healing, slowly, like thawing earth. He didn't plan to go to the fire, not exactly, but he couldn't sit still either. He told himself he'd only go as far as the edge of the trees, just far enough to see if the smoke came from someone passing through or someone staying. There was a difference in the way fires were built, difference in the way smoke moved when it came from a campfire hastily made for a quick meal versus one built for staying overnight. He'd learned to read smoke the way others read maps, and something about this one made him think it was the kind that meant permanence, or at least the hope of it. He waited until the sky dimmed into that pale purplish stretch, where day lets go but night hasn't quite found its place. Then he stood, tightened the coat around his ribs, and stepped between the trees. His boots made little sound against the softening ground, the snow now more slush than powder. The orchard was still, and he moved through it like someone walking through an old memory. Each tree felt familiar, each broken, branch and low-slung limb marking the path he had taken so many times before. But tonight it all felt slightly different, as though the trees had leaned back a little, giving him space to pass. He followed the slope of the land towards the ridge, the smoke drawing him forward. When he reached the edge where the trees began to thin, he dropped low and moved between the trunks, careful to stay behind the cover of brush and bark. From here he could see a small clearing where the smoke grew from a fire ringed by stones, the flames dancing quietly within a circle of logs. There was a tent, canvas, not much bigger than a pup tent, and beside it, 2 figures, a man and a girl maybe. It was hard to tell from this distance. The firelight flickered against their faces, making their features move like shadows. He crouched and watched, silent. The 2 figures were speaking, but their voices didn't carry. They weren't loud. They didn't laugh or argue, just talked, as people do when there's nothing left to prove. The girl, yes, it was a girl, had her hair tied back in a cloth scarf, and she was stirring something in a small pot over the flames. The man sat with one hand near the fire, palm open to the heat, his shoulders hunched like someone who'd grown used to protecting their own warmth from the wind. They didn't look dangerous. If anything, they looked tired. He stayed there until the sun had fully dropped, and the fire was the only light in the clearing. Then he stood slowly, straightened his coat, and stepped into view. The man turned first. Not with alarm, but with a stillness that came from years of expecting surprises. His eyes followed the boy as he crossed into the clearing, and the girl paused with the spoon mid-stir. The boy raised one hand, not in greeting exactly, but in peace. "I saw your fire," he said. His voice cracked slightly from disuse, but it held. The man nodded once, then gestured toward one of the logs circling the flames. "You hungry?" The boy hesitated only briefly, then stepped forward and sat. The fire reached for him, like an old friend, and the heat curled around his shins and fingers, making his body relax before his mind even agreed to it. The girl resumed stirring. The pot gave off a scent of beans and something else he couldn't place, something sharp and earthy. "We don't have much," the man said, his voice low and even, "but we share what we can." The boy nodded. "Thank you." They didn't ask him where he came from, they didn't ask his name, and he didn't offer it, not right away. The girl ladled a small scoop into a tin bowl and handed it to him with quiet eyes. He accepted it carefully, the warmth of the metal seeping into his palms. The first bite was hot and thick, beans softened into a kind of stew, with bits of something meaty, maybe salt pork, maybe just the memory of it. It didn't matter. It tasted real. And it reminded him of a time when food had flavour, not just function. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling gently, the pot steaming. Finally, the man spoke again. "We passed through this way before," he said. "Years back. This orchard was full then, apples so heavy they bent the branches." The boy looked up. "My father used to tend them." The man nodded, slowly. "A good man, if it's the one I'm thinking of. Always gave the soft apples away before frost." The boy said nothing, just stared into the fire and let the memory settle between them. The girl finished her meal and sat back on her heels, watching the boy now, her eyes not curious but kind. "We're heading north," she said. "If the trains start running again." "They won't," the man said softly. She looked at him, then back to the boy. "But we'll still go." He didn't know what to say. He didn't want to leave the orchard, but he understood the need to keep moving. He thought of the ledger, the letter, the tin of nails, his mother sleeping in the shack that still stood because he had patched it one piece at a time. He thought of the match he hadn't used. "I live just past the trees," he said. "It's not much, but it's warm." The man gave a small nod. "Then you're already richer than most." The fire began to die down, the flames shrinking into themselves. The girl stood and added another log, coaxing it back to life. The boy finished his meal and handed the bowl back, his hands no longer shaking. "I should go," he said, rising. "Come back if you want," the girl said. "We'll be here through tomorrow." He nodded and turned to go, the firelight casting his shadow long behind him. As he walked back through the trees, the orchard seemed less lonely. The wind moved differently now, not as a warning, but as a song wrapping around the trunks and guiding him home. And for the first time in weeks, he felt not just like someone surviving, but someone remembered. The boy returned to the shack just as the stars were beginning to settle into their usual rhythm above the orchard. They hung low and still, blinking faintly through the thin shroud of clouds that drifted east with the wind. He moved quietly, not for fear of waking his mother, but out of habit. The kind of quiet that came when you knew every creak and groan of wood beneath your feet might mean something. A warning, a whisper, a memory not quite ready to be disturbed. Inside, the warmth had faded. The last of the fire's breath clung to the air like a sigh. His mother lay curled on her side, the blanket tucked around her knees, her breathing soft and slow. He paused to listen just to be sure, then pulled his coat tighter and sat beside the stove. His legs ached from the walk, but it wasn't the sort of ache that begged for rest. It was the kind that reminded him he had moved through the world and found something waiting. Something that hadn't taken from him. Not this time. He didn't sleep right away. His thoughts still lingered around the fire in the clearing, around the way the man had watched the flames like they were speaking, and the girl had stirred the pot like it was part of some ritual she carried out from a place she hadn't been in years. There was something in their silence that felt familiar. Not just the absence of sound, but the presence of restraint. They hadn't asked anything of him, and that, more than kindness, had earned his trust. By morning the clouds had thickened again, and the sky was a dull smear of grey. The wind had died completely, and the orchard stood motionless beneath the weight of a stillness so complete it felt like a held breath. He stepped outside with a single thought. He would go back. Not because he was hungry, though the stew had filled him in a way he hadn't known he missed. He would go back because something there had shifted, and he wanted to understand what it was. He left his mother a note scratched on the inside of a matchbox cover, placing it beside the stove with the last match. "Back soon," it read. "Firewood under blanket." He didn't know if she'd wake while he was gone, but he knew she'd see it when she did. She always looked for small things first. The path to the clearing felt shorter this time, or maybe his feet were just more certain. The trees didn't crowd him as much, their branches lifted by the still air. The sky above remained dim, but not threatening. It was the kind of sky that held snow in its belly, but hadn't yet made the choice to let it fall. When he reached the edge of the orchard, he saw at once that something had changed. The fire was out. The ring of stone still sat in its place, but no smoke rose. The tent was gone. The logs remained, one tipped onto its side, but the cart, the pot, the travellers, all of it had vanished. He stepped into the clearing slowly, his breath held in his throat. It was not the shock of finding them gone that stopped him. It was the fact that they had left without a trace, and yet something lingered. A scent in the air. The faint outline of footprints in the soft ground. A feeling. He crossed to the spot where the fire had burned and crouched low. The coals were cold, but not ancient. They had left this morning early, perhaps just before dawn. He reached out and touched one of the stone, now streaked with soot. Then, as he stood, his eye caught something glinting in the grass beside the log. A small tin cup, slightly dented but clean. Inside was a folded scrap of paper. He picked it up carefully, unfolded it, and read the words written in neat slanted lines. "Thank you for the quiet. Keep your fire burning when you can. Maybe we'll see each other again. No name, no signature. Just those 3 lines, enough to fill the space they left behind." He folded the note and slid it into his pocket, then turned and looked back toward the orchard. Nothing had changed there, not outwardly, but it felt different now, as though it had witnessed something too. He returned to the shack slower than before, not because he was tired, but because he was thinking. The kind of thinking that doesn't need words. the kind that seeps into your bones and settles there until it shapes you without you noticing. When he stepped inside, his mother was sitting up, the blanket pulled around her shoulders, the matchbox cover in her hand. She looked up as he entered, her eyes sharp. "You found something," she said. He nodded and sat beside her. "They're gone now." She didn't ask who. Instead, she placed the matchbox cover down and reached for the small cup he still held. She turned it in her hands, studying its weight. "They left you this?" He nodded again. "And a note." She smiled faintly. "Sometimes people leave more than they think." The rest of the day passed quietly. He checked the boards again, tightened the rope across the door. He used one of the nails to anchor a loose slat near the window, driving it in with the back of a hatchet head. The sound echoed through the room like a heartbeat. At dusk, he lit the fire again. The last match flared to life with a hiss and a bloom of light that seemed too bright for its size. He held it to the kindling and watched it catch, the flame biting into the dry wood with hungry little snaps. The stove began to breathe again. His mother sipped warm water from a tin cup, her hand steady for the first time in days. She watched the fire as he sat beside her, the heat folding around them like a blanket. "You're doing well," she said quietly. He didn't answer, just nodded. Outside, the wind began to stir again, rustling the orchard in long, slow strokes. The stars returned, blinking through the breaks in the clouds. The boy sat back, his body relaxed against the wall, the note still in his pocket, the tin cup resting beside him. He had not spoken much that day, but something in him had shifted. Not everything had to stay, not everyone did. But some things could be held on to even after they were gone, and he knew, without needing to be told, that he would remember the smoke rising beyond the trees for the rest of his life. The fire burned low, and the boy let it. He had learned to let the flames decide how much they wanted to give. There were days when it felt like the stove was offering more than warmth, when it seemed to carry some kind of voice, a slow murmur in the way the logs crackled and sighed. Other days it held back, asking for more coaxing, more patience. That morning it burned just enough to take the edge off the cold, enough to stretch their time. They had grown careful with fuel now, careful with everything. The orchard outside was still, but not in the way it had been weeks before when everything had felt dead. Now it felt like it was holding its breath. The branches no longer drooped under frost, and small rivulets had begun to trickle down the hills, thin ribbons of meltwater carving paths into the hardened soil. Somewhere beneath the surface, life was considering a return, not a promise, but a thought. The boy watched the trees often, as if waiting for them to speak. Inside the shack, his mother moved more easily. She sat near the stove with her legs tucked beneath her, and her shoulders no longer drawn tight against her ears. Her cheeks held a touch of colour, and the cough that had once rattled her chest now came only rarely. She still tired quickly, and there were stretches of the day when she would close her eyes and drift off, her breath soft and shallow. But she was waking from those naps now with questions, with stories on her tongue. She was coming back to herself, one thread at a time. They passed the days in a rhythm that felt both aimless and sacred. He would check the boards and the rope, tidy the corner where they kept the ledger and the remaining nails, and sometimes walk out to the orchard just to listen. He didn't go far anymore, not because he feared what lay beyond, but because he felt drawn inward. There was something in the act of staying still that now felt more powerful than the need to wander. He had chased food and fire, had followed smoke and voices, but now he found meaning in simply being present. One afternoon, while the light pressed against the walls in soft golden slants, his mother asked him to open the ledger again. Her voice was clear, and her hand steady as she reached for it. He brought it to her, set it on the floor between them, and sat cross-legged beside it. She opened it with care, her fingers slow and deliberate. She turned through the pages not like someone looking for something, but like someone remembering how to read an old friend's face. Her eyes paused at her own name again, resting there longer this time. She didn't speak, but he saw her lips move slightly, mouthing something. Then she turned the page and found the empty note in the back, the one he had placed there after reading the letter from the strangers. She unfolded it slowly, reread the simple lines, and held the paper in her lap. "There's something in knowing we weren't forgotten," she said, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire. He nodded. He didn't have to ask who she meant. He understood now that the ledger was never just about debt or credit. It was about presence, about saying, "I was here, we were here, we mattered." Later, as the sky shifted into its twilight hush, they sat together and watched the flame. They didn't need to speak. There was peace in the quiet, the kind of peace that comes not from comfort, but from endurance, from knowing that somehow, against the long odds of a harsh world, they had made it to this moment. And when the wind picked up that night, brushing past the shack like a hand sliding across a sleeping shoulder, neither of them stirred. The boy lay beside his mother, listening to her breathing, his own matching it. The world outside was still uncertain. The orchard might never bear fruit again, but for the first time in a long while the boy did not feel like a ghost drifting through a forgotten story. He felt rooted, like the trees themselves, waiting and alive. The days grew longer without making much noise about it. The light stayed a little later in the orchard, softening across the gnarled trunks as if it too had decided to linger. The boy noticed it first in the shadows. They did not disappear any faster, but they stretched out differently, less hurried, more like fingers idly dragging through dust. He marked it without words, storing it somewhere in that private place where he kept small signs of change. It wasn't warmth yet, but it was something like the thought of warmth, the whisper that winter could not last forever. Each morning he stepped outside before speaking, before even looking toward the stove. He needed to see the trees. He would take a few careful steps out from the shack, coat wrapped close, and gaze across the orchard like someone reading an unwritten page. He watched the bark for hints of colour, watched the ground for dark patches where meltwater gathered. Once he found a beetle, sluggish and stunned by the cold, crawling beneath a log that had thawed just enough to breathe. He let it be. It was a kind of proof, and he respected it. His mother watched him from the doorway some days now, wrapped in the blanket they had repaired together, using pieces of old shirts and grain sack patches. Her hair had begun to grow out again, soft wisps curling around her cheeks. She spoke more often, asked about the orchard, asked about the wind, and once even laughed at the way he described a squirrel darting through the trees like it was late for an appointment. Her laugh startled him. It was a sound that hadn't lived in the shack for so long that it took him a moment to recognize it. But when it came, it filled the space like sunlight on floorboards, and he found himself laughing too, just a little. They were eating better, though it was still sparse. A man from the far end of the road had passed by 2 days ago with a bag of dried beans and a jar of something thick and sweet, maybe molasses, maybe something homemade. He had traded it for 2 of the nails and a piece of the old canvas they had no more use for. The boy did not ask where the man had gotten the jar. They both knew some things weren't worth the question. But the gift fed them for 3 nights, and on the 4th the boy found himself thinking not about where the next meal would come from, but about what to do with the days themselves. He had begun to clear a space near the orchard's edge. Not to plant yet. The ground was still too hard, but to prepare. He gathered stones and marked a square of earth no larger than a blanket. He pulled up old roots and cleared fallen branches, working slowly, not out of exhaustion, but out of a sense of care. This land had given nothing for so long, yet still he believed it owed them nothing. If anything, he owed it. So he worked without expectation, just to show it that he still believed in the shape of seasons. The ledger remained closed now most days, not because it had lost its weight, but because it had served its purpose. It sat on the shelf with the tin of nails and the folded letter, a collection of proof. Not memories exactly, but anchors. His mother had said once that the trick to surviving wasn't holding on to every piece of the past. It was knowing which pieces to let rest. He understood that now. The shack itself had become something like that. A resting place for all they had lived through, and also a place to begin again. That afternoon he heard the sound of wood splitting, not from their own home, but somewhere down the road. It came faint and sharp, like someone chopping kindling. The boy paused in his work and stood still, listening. There it was again. A rhythm. Not hurried, not careless, just the clean strike of blade into bark. He walked up the rise, past the bend where the orchard sloped toward the fence, and looked out toward the road. There was no cart, no smoke, just the sound floating back toward him on the still air. It meant someone was close. Maybe the travellers had returned, or maybe someone else had chosen to stay. He didn't move toward the sound. Not yet. He simply acknowledged it. Another heartbeat in the land. That evening he told his mother about the noise. "Think they'll come this way?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. "But they don't have to," she nodded, settling deeper into her blanket. "Let them come if they will. We're not waiting any more." He sat beside her, watching the sky bleed slowly into night. The stars emerged like breath held too long and finally released. They were not as sharp as in winter, but they were steady. The orchard was quiet, but no longer empty. Things were moving, even if they moved slow. The boy rested his head against the wall and felt the soft thrum of his own body, strong and calm. The waiting season was nearly done. Beneath the bark, something was blooming. The days moved forward like a quiet hand guiding the boy's back, no longer urgent, no longer trembling. Spring, real spring, had begun to press its fingers into the folds of the earth, and the orchard was slowly changing colour. Not loudly, not all at once, but in the patient way that trees remember to stretch. The boy noticed the buds first on the older branches, the ones that hadn't given fruit in years. Pale green tips, like thoughts, like the memory of something once possible. He didn't tell his mother, at first. He wanted to be sure. He wanted to give her the news only when it felt certain, as if speaking it too early might cause the trees to take it back. Each morning he returned to the edge of the orchard, to the place he had cleared weeks before. The square of earth was no longer stiff with frost. It was soft beneath his fingers, crumbling in his palm like something willing to be shaped. He knelt and pushed the tips of his fingers into it just to feel it respond. And one morning, when the air smelled different, less like wood smoke, more like rain, he planted 3 seeds from the bundle he had forgotten he carried, tucked away in the corner of his coat's inside pocket, seeds that came from a pouch marked only with a date and a smudged name he couldn't quite read. His mother had begun to rise earlier now. She folded her blanket neatly each day, placed it at the foot of her cot, and swept the shack's floor with the broken broom handle she had once cursed. She hummed sometimes, just beneath her breath, and her voice had returned to the kind of softness that shaped words like hands shape cloth. Some nights, when the stove was still warm, she would tell stories again. Not long ones, not loud ones, but small pieces of before, stories of the orchard when the trees were younger, of the men who came to pick apples with handkerchiefs tied at their throats and songs in their mouths. She spoke of his father without sadness now, her voice not carrying weight but presence, like setting a photo on the table and letting it stay. One morning, while the sky was still pale and damp from the night, the boy stepped outside and heard something he hadn't in so long he almost didn't recognise it. Birds. Just 2 of them, hidden high among the branches, their calls bright and unhurried. He looked up and smiled without meaning to. It was the kind of sound that reminded him the world had other stories still unfolding. He stood still until they flew off, their wings brushing against the early light. He spent the afternoon walking farther than usual, past the orchard's boundary, and toward the place where the road split in 2 directions. There, at the curve where the dust began to gather in little whirls, he saw a set of footprints that did not belong to him. One pair, narrow and deliberate, and another heavier, spaced wide. They were not recent, maybe a day old, but they led nowhere, just a passing through. He didn't follow them. He didn't need to. That night they shared the last of the beans and sat in the doorway watching the sky turn. The stars came later now, hidden behind thicker blue, but they still came. The boy sat with his legs stretched out, his hands in his lap feeling the wood of the door frame behind his back. His mother leaned her head gently against the wall beside him, her eyes half closed. "What do you think the apples will taste like this year?" she asked. He turned his head toward her. If they come at all, they'll be sweeter than I remember." She nodded. "Maybe they always were. We just didn't know it then." The fire inside the stove had died down, but neither of them moved to feed it. The warmth from the day still lingered in the walls, and outside the wind had softened to a hush. The boy reached into his pocket and felt the folded note from the travellers, the one he'd carried since the fire by the ridge. He didn't need to read it again. He knew the words by heart. Keep your fire burning when you can, he would. And if the trees gave fruit this year, he would leave a basket by the road, just one, and mark it with a stone. No note, no name, just a way to say they were still here. Just a way to say they had stayed. The sky darkened, the orchard quieted, and inside the small wooden shack, a boy and his mother rested against time. The world would go on, and so would they.